This is Queer Voices.
Welcome to Queer Voices. This is Summer Eiman with our guest, Professor Jordan B. Peterson. He is a tenured professor at the University of Toronto and a clinical psychologist. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Houston recently attempted to pass a non-discrimination ordinance that failed in a referendum, and currently in Canada, you're speaking out against a piece of federal legislation called Bill C-16. Now, this is purported to be a human rights bill. What is your opposition to this? What are your underlying issues with this bill?
Well, my fundamental complaint about the bill is that it's associated with a set of policies that have already been established as law in Canada's largest province, Ontario, which is where I live. And the policy guidelines that make the framework from within which the bill will be interpreted are very punitive and arbitrary and restrictive. So, for example, they require the use of what have come to be known as preferred pronouns for referring to people who don't fit easily into what's often known as the gender binary. And so the government has put itself in the position of requiring a certain kind of speech by legislative fiat, and has also instantiated the idea that gender is a social construct into the law. And in fact, more specifically than that, have instantiated the idea that biological sex and gender identity vary independently, which is patently false. So I have two fundamental objections. One is that the government has no business whatsoever requiring people to perform certain speech acts. I think that's a reprehensible idea, and it's a line that no free society should allow government to cross. And second, there's no evidence whatsoever that gender identity and biological sex vary independently, although there are exceptions to the relationship between them. So it's very bad legislation. It's scientifically flawed, and it's philosophically reprehensible. And so the fact that it's about people who are transgendered is more of a side issue than anything else.
Your objection is, as I understand it, that you don't think that the science is particularly sound, though this is something that's been discussed in queer studies for quite some time.
Sure, it's been discussed really since 1955, when John Money came up with the idea that gender was a social construct and that biological sex was, well, although people now even debate the existence of biological sex. But the problem is that biological sex and gender identity are by no means very independently, and the evidence for that is that more than 99% of people have a gender identity that's in precise concordance with their biological sex. And so by the very fact of that association, and you can make it 95% if you want, the fact that concordance is so high indicates immediately that those two things do not vary independently, which is what the legislation insists. And to formulate legislation, you have to be very precise about your terminology, because you run into trouble if you're not. Now, that doesn't mean, as I said, that there are no people who don't fit neatly into gender binary categories. There are, of course, people who are born with mixed genetic sexuality, sometimes mixed sexuality at the level of functional genitalia, although that's very, very rare. But there's an insistence coming from the postmodernists, mostly within the university, that biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual preference are all social constructs, well, perhaps with the exception of biological sex, although that's become debatable as well, and that they all vary independently. And none of that is true. So the government shouldn't be in the business of deciding which sets of facts are going to be mandated legislatively. And there are very harsh punishments for transgressing against these laws as well. And so I think it's incredibly dangerous to allow the government to determine the ideological content of or the philosophical or the scientific content of people's thought and to regulate their speech output. And it's going to be just as big a problem for people all across the political spectrum. It has very little to do with ideological stance. So there's an old adage in military technology development, which is that if you create a new weapon, you can be sure that your enemy will have it within one generation. So at the moment, these limitations on speech output are being utilized by people on the left, but you can be absolutely sure that if they're allowed to stand, that in no time flat, they'll be also used by people on the right. So it's a very bad idea. And that bill is now locked up in the Canadian Senate because there has been a fair bit of public, I would say, outrage about its content once people started to understand exactly what was going on. So,
well, okay, so this particular piece of legislation was very overbroad, used bad science, so on and so forth. Do you think that it is an appropriate use of governmental resources to try to mandate non-discrimination at all, or do you disagree with that?
Well, no, I don't. I think that arbitrary. Let's define discrimination first. So, discrimination occurs, or unreasonable discrimination occurs when a person is denied an opportunity that they could easily fulfill because of their skills, let's say, or their abilities, or merely the fact of their being. And any act of arbitrary discrimination is not only harmful to the individual in question, but is actually harmful to society at large, because you want to set up your society so that the most qualified people have the appropriate opportunities, regardless of those traits that they might possess that are irrelevant to the situation in question. But I believe that there's more than sufficient legislation in place, especially in a country like Canada, to already guarantee those rights, and that this is an unreasonable extension of the notion of discrimination. And I think the reason it emerged, at least in part, is because there's an entire industry predicated on pushing the kind of agenda that underlies this kind of legislation, and things have become, roughly speaking, so non-discriminatory that we're running out of victims to keep the machine operating.
Well, I'm gonna have to cut you off there, unfortunately, because we're very short on time. But I really do appreciate you coming on the show and giving us a very different perspective. Thank you very much. This is Queer Voices.
Hey, nice talking with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson.